All right, hopefully you are seeing my slides. Madeline, give me a thumbs up if we are. Looks good. Okay, great. So today we're going to be talking about using surveys as a tool for visitor use management. This is a really large topic, and so we can only hit some of the highlights today. So we've chosen to focus on a number of things that seem to come up repeatedly in our conversations with managers and some insights that we've learned from our experiences over time. And we should have plenty of time at the end for questions if we haven't hit on something that is of interest to you in particular. So I'll start out by just talking about the role of surveys in visitor use management, given that we are working within the VWAM framework. I'll talk a little bit about some general approaches to using surveys. Sampling is something that comes up routinely, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some considerations. A few things related to data management and analysis when you're using survey data, a few final tips, and then discussion and question time. So our focus, as I said, is primarily on the role that surveys can play in visitor use management, although we'll hit on some other values of them. And so to start out, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the visitor use management framework. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not be. And if you would like to learn more about the framework, there are a number of resources available, including some that our team has developed, short presentation overview and some case study examples as well. So what is the VWAM framework? This is a national approach that was developed by federal land management agencies based on a few decades of experience attempting to manage some kind of challenging visitor use issues related to visitor conflict, related to visitor crowding, related to visitor experience. It was published in 2016 with a guidebook in 2019, so it's fairly recent. And being piloted in a number of places in federal agencies, but this effort in California is one of the first sort of large-scale efforts to see how it works at the state level with the kinds of issues that you experience in state parks. It's important to note that the framework was created to provide a defensible, legally defensible, scalable and flexible process to identify issues, evaluate management actions, and implement change in an adaptive management type of approach. It, like many planning frameworks, begins with statements of desired conditions. If you're a planner, this is something near and dear to your heart. Desired conditions being qualitative statements about an area's look or feel, the kinds of experiences that someone would have. And those conditions arise from agency policy, unit-specific guidance, to be crafted for the appropriate for the unit in question or zones within a unit. The framework also relies on developing objective indicators and measures for desired conditions. This is part of that being defensible aspect, that indicators are things that are measurable, that capture things that we can observe on the ground in an objective way that relate to desired conditions, that managers can determine when conditions reach some level that's deemed unacceptable. And in the overall framework, those data are collected through monitoring over time, and they guide adaptive management to address issues. So how do surveys fit into this? Well, surveys are an important part of getting at certain kinds of desired conditions, particularly those related to visitor experiences. Visitor experiences are intrinsically personal and emotional and cognitive, and those are things that surveys are well designed to get at. So how do you come up with desired condition statements related to those visitor experiences? The framework suggests thinking about things like these questions. What experiences should people expect to find here in the future? What is it that you tell people is unique about this place? What is it that's unique about this particular area within a park unit? These are all things that can be translated into desired condition statements. So here are a few examples from the work that we have been doing at Big Basin over the last year. We consulted the general plan, the re-envisioning Big Basin framework and principles, and crafted a couple of, well, several, but these are a couple of the examples related to the kind of more emotional and cognitive experiences people might have at Big Basin, such as experiencing awe and splendor of these forests, experiencing the historic feel of the park through various eras. However, we also have some other items, some other desired condition statements that also lend themselves towards using surveys to assess. This first one here, this third bullet, relates to safety and access. A desired condition is that visitors of all physical abilities have opportunities for safe, comfortable, non-strenuous travel. That's something that we can probably best assess through a survey. And the last one, also, visitors engaged in different activities can all enjoy the setting without interfering with others' enjoyment. This relates to experiences of conflict. And this is also one that we would probably best measure through surveys, harder to get at with any other kind of measure like an observational measure. So we have these general desired condition statements, and then how do we turn those into measures that we can use within this VUM framework? And here are a couple of examples of how we did that at Big Basin. One related to safety was a survey question that asked if people felt prepared for common safety conditions that they might encounter. We listed what those were at Big Basin, and they could indicate they felt not prepared, somewhat prepared, or very prepared. And the indicator within the VUM framework could be the percentage of people who felt unprepared, or the percentage of groups that had visitors who felt unprepared for the conditions, and we can objectively and quantitatively document that. Another very common approach is a satisfaction type of element. In this case, we asked people on a scale of -2 very unsatisfied to +2 very satisfied, how they felt about a variety of elements like a welcoming park environment, being able to see the redwood trees, seeing those iconic big trees. That links back to the desired condition of experiencing these forests. Hearing natural sounds links back to the experience of seeing these forests. Positive interactions with other visitors links back to a potential indicator related to conflict. So we go through a process of thinking about how do we actually turn those desired conditions into something that is measurable. And that is a key role of surveys in the VUM framework. I do want to point out, though, that surveys have a number of other benefits. I'm sure you can think of several yourself. The ones I've just been talking about are represented on the far right-hand side of this diagram here that relate to visitor experience evaluations. All of those items that I just showed were related to people providing their feedback on their park experiences. But the data can also be useful for short-term and long-term planning and management decisions. So things like understanding who's visiting, characteristics of trip planning, so working with Big Basin on their shuttle system, understanding if people are using the website, how far in advance are they planning. Those are things that we can get at easily with a survey. We can use that same survey to get multiple of these kinds of types of information. Also importantly, many units, many areas and agencies use surveys to get at economic impacts. You can get at views about facilities for long-term facility planning. We had some of those in Big Basin. Types of activities, communication interests, what topics are people interested for interpretive programming. And then also just overall in terms of communicating the value of parks, this kind of information on economic impact or the extent of visitor satisfaction, which is typically quite high, can be really useful for an agency to report out and communicate about their work. So regardless of the purpose of your survey, it might be one or many of those kinds of objectives, you need to be clear about what you're going to use the data for. Oftentimes people kind of rush into writing a survey without really thinking through how am I going to link specific data points to specific purposes of those data. So know why you're asking them. I just show an example here from the Army Corps of their comment card, and you see they have a question about what's your primary activity. They want to understand how do different activity groups experience these different elements like safety. And so they need to understand, they need to be able to characterize their respondents according to their activity group. Question wording is an art, and being careful to craft your questions well is critical to making the data usable or valuable. There are many good guides and FAQs out there about common problems to avoid, like vague language, like double-barreled questions. There's lots on that. I'm not going to go into that today, but it definitely is an art to do that. Generally, I suggest avoiding open-ended questions. We often include a few of these on a survey, but if your survey is primarily open-ended, it becomes really challenging to analyze and challenging to code and report. So generally, where possible, asking closed-ended questions is good. I do want to direct your attention to the existence of many existing instruments. In particular, the Park Service has what's called the Pool of Known Questions. If you work in the Park Service world, we talk about this all the time. This is a compendium that's been developed over years now of questions that have been approved by the agency for use in visitor use management kinds of contexts. It's almost 300 pages long, so it's very comprehensive, but it's very well organized. It's got 11 different topics and themes like experience quality, safety, constraints, expenditures, demographics. There's categories, these 11 categories of questions with multiple examples of different formats within them. And so it's very useful. Among all of the researchers who've been doing survey research in parks for the last few decades, probably there are very few questions that you might want to ask that haven't been asked in some form or flavor before. And I put the link on there, but if you were to Google MPS Pool of Known Questions, you'd find that. Okay, so that's a little bit on on the writing questions themselves. Now let's talk a little bit about how do you approach survey administration. Well, there's really three main buckets of modalities that are used: mail surveys, web-based surveys, and on-site surveys. And I'll just say a few things about each of them in turn. Mail surveys used to be quite common. In fact, when I was in graduate school, this was the primary way, other than on-site surveys, that we gathered information about visitors and interested publics. But they're really increasingly being dropped as a mode of data collection, primarily because of cost and because of non-response rates. I'll say a little bit about that in a second. But they require a sample frame, which is another limitation, that you need to have a list of people and a list of addresses to send surveys to. And so that's often not available, or you would have to be on site to gather that information anyway. So it just doesn't seem practical to use a mail survey. So this example is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation. This is a national population level survey that's done across the United States for the past about 40 years, not annually, but at intervals. I think it's been done maybe 4 or 5 times now over the past 40 years. When it was first launched, it was done only by mail. And this is a hugely important resource because it provides state level data on expenditures and participation rates, participation by demographics, and it's one of the few data sets that's available for that anywhere. This report that just came out in 2022, or came out for the 2022 survey, is really state of the art. And they used multiple modalities to contact people: phone, mail, and web. They included a $5 incentive for participating in the survey. And even so, their response rate was about 10%. And so, when you start getting response rates that are down in that level, which sadly is about what we get these days with mail response, you start to wonder if you've got a representative sample or not. And it's hard to know that. You can understand whether it's demographically similar to the population, but that doesn't always tell you whether the responses about specific questions are representative or not. But despite all of those limitations, sometimes mail surveys are one of the ways that we can reach non-visitors, and sometimes that's an important management objective, is to understand who's not visiting parks and maybe why they aren't. So web surveys have largely replaced mail surveys. They have advantages of being very low cost. There's no printing and mailing charges, and there's no manual data entry required. There's 2 main ways that web surveys get used. The first one is making a link available to anyone, which I'm calling publicly available here. And that has the advantage of eliciting responses from engaged stakeholders. which may be precisely where you want to go. If you're interested in your engaged group, this can be a very good way to get data from them. But because it's available to anyone, we are not sure whether it's representative in terms of types of visitors. Not everybody goes to websites and clicks on links. And maybe the people who do might have certain views more so than your typical visitor. You know, the people who care passionately about a place are likely to respond, and maybe folks who are less concerned, but a large part of the population might not be represented well. But you don't know about representativeness unless you have some other way to find companion data. And I bring this up because this is an interesting example from a project that one of our students did outside of Bozeman. This was an area where there was some access to some Forest Service trail system, and a local nonprofit was acquiring some land around the trailhead that they were considering developing into a little bit more developed facilities, parking and so on. And it was near to some residential areas, and so potentially controversial. And what the student did was he collected survey data on site from a representative sample. And then he also posted a link on various websites and pushed it out through social media. And this area is used for hang gliding. So there's a hang gliding group. And so we went into the study thinking, oh, we very well could get very different responses from interested stakeholders who come across it online or push it out to their friends online and the on-site group. And in fact, we did not find that, which was really surprising to us, that our on-site data were virtually identical to our web-based data. That was great from the perspective of the organization that was going to use the data, because it, essentially triangulated that, yeah, we looked at a couple of different ways of getting public input, and it really resonated across the board. But you won't know that unless you collect the data in both ways. And sometimes you can be challenged on that if you simply don't know. So another way, rather than just putting a link out on a website, would be to give access to a web survey through targeted distribution. And this shows an example of what we did at Big Basin this summer. We had these cards with a QR code where we would be on site, and visitors who were turned away or visitors who were using the 15-minute parking spots could take this card, take it home, and we wrote an ID number on so that we knew that we could track who was responding based on who we contacted on site, so we could understand what our sample looked like. However, response rates can be quite low. In this case, our response rate was well under 10%, I think. And so, again, I'm very glad that we, in this case, went with on-site data collection, because our web-based approaches just were not getting the responses that we had hoped to get. And so, speaking of on-site surveys, there's two main ways to do it. One is the good old-fashioned paper pen way. The other is some kind of electronic interface like Survey123 on tablets. Many places do that. In the case of the Big Basin project, we ended up going with paper forms for a couple of reasons. One, the connectivity isn't good at the park, but also it allowed our interns who were distributing surveys to contact many more people. They were able to simply walk up, run through their script, hand a survey to people, and then move on to contact the next group, and then come back and collect the surveys later. So it was a very efficient mode of data collection. It did require data entry, which an electronic version does not, or an electronic platform doesn't, but it worked very well in that particular case. And our response rate was about 50% at Big Basin this summer, which is pretty good these days. So those are your choices about how you can approach collecting data. And then we get into some of the nuts and bolts. And two questions that I feel like I almost always get asked are, how much data do I need? And do I need a random sample of data? These come up all the time. It's like, okay, I think I can figure out writing questions and entering data, but how do I approach the sampling? And I'm here to tell you that the answer is it depends. It depends on a number of factors. So you have a couple of different general approaches One would be this random sample, and the other is either convenience or purposive sample. A random sample is defined as every member of the population has equal and known probability of participating or being selected. So this would be something like, I randomly select days, I show up and I randomly survey every 10th visitor. Then I know that I've got a representative sample of that population. On the other hand, a convenience sample is one where it's simply haphazard. So maybe comment cards or that open web survey, where we can't document response rates and we simply don't know if we have captured a representative snapshot of the population that's visiting. Purposive sampling would be targeted sampling, where we're intentionally looking to certain kinds of users or certain folks. So, but both convenience and purposive sampling, because we don't know that if they're representative, it's really not appropriate to use inferential statistics with them. So why is a random sample the gold standard? Well, it gives you an unbiased estimate. It gives you confidence in understanding the properties of the variation in your group. Are people really similar? Are they very different? What dimensions do they break across? And you can use inferential statistics if that becomes important because of, say, a level of controversy or something in your project that you really feel like you need to be able to talk about statistical inference from that. It also allows you to track trends over time much more reliably, because if you collect random samples in multiple years, you know the data are comparable. If you have convenience samples in different years, you don't know if any differences that appear from year to year are actual differences in the population, or whether they're differences just based on who you happen to encounter. So random sampling is the gold standard, but people might ask, is convenience sampling always problematic? And I would say no. It really depends on how you want to use the data, how confident you need to be. And it can be much cheaper to implement. You can use convenience sampling with existing staff if they can distribute surveys when it's convenient to them. And that may give you data that you just simply couldn't get any data for otherwise. It allows you to focus on known issues, and it can generate useful information. For example, let's say you get a reasonably large convenience sample across activity groups, and you find that pretty much everybody's very similar in their responses on a particular question. Maybe you don't need additional data. It's like, wow, I think I've captured the variation and people are pretty homogeneous. So it can be a useful way to generate information, can be a useful entree into deciding if you need to collect more information later on. So strategies for random sampling, it's almost always useful to think about stratification. Are there different places or times that you want to be able to represent adequately? If so, collecting random samples within each of those strata is probably more useful than a simple random sample. So for example, sampling on one weekend day and one weekday every week would generate enough data to be able to compare whether weekends and weekdays are similar. A simple random sample is going to give you 5 of every 7 sample points is going to be a weekday, so you might not end up with a large enough sample of weekend days if you just use a simple random sample. I often recommend just starting small. Like if you don't have a lot of resources, you can gather data from a handful of data points, times, places, whatever, and look at the data and decide if you need to implement more systematic, rigorous methods later on. For convenience sampling, building in procedures that enhance the representativeness. So yes, you're going to collect data during 15 minutes every day, the time of day, try to do some in the morning, try to do some in the afternoon. If that allows you to use staff time efficiently, that's good. You've built in some variation in there to capture potentially different visitors at different times of day. Collecting other data that can help you understand whether your data are representative is also a good strategy. And this next slide, I'm going to just show an example of that. This graph illustrates trail counter data from a project we did at Mount Hood. And the blue bars are weekdays, the black bars are weekend days, and not surprisingly, weekend days are more heavily used. You can see there's a fair amount of variation in use on this trail. And so imagine a hypothetical scenario where we collected surveys on 5 days, and they were these days. What do you notice about these data points? Well, they all tend to be high use, and they all tend to be early in the season. So, maybe I was collecting data with volunteers who were really more available on weekends, and they weren't available after the middle of the summer. So you look at this and you think, okay, the data that we got are potentially better representative of high use times, early season times. Are they fully representative of the whole season? Maybe not as much. And if we contrast that with, say, a scenario like this, where we collected more data across more variation in use levels across longer season, we could make a case that these data are more defensible and more representative. So you may not have use data for a particular location, but you might have some general use data for your unit, say your paid visitation counts. You might have something else that's locally relevant, and you can just use professional judgment and inspection to say, okay, do I have reason to believe that these data might be biased in any way? Or do they seem like they might be representative of key dimensions like use levels or seasons? The question of how much data do you need really depends on several factors. One is the intrinsic variation in the population. If a population is very homogeneous, you only need a very small sample. Unfortunately, you generally don't know how homogeneous your population is until after you gather some data, which is one of the reasons that doing sort of an initial small pilot can be useful. If you find high levels of variability and you think it's important to get more precise measures, then you may decide you need more data. But there's no good general golden rule on sample size. Typically, we'll shoot for having 100 to a couple of hundred surveys at a minimum if we're trying to characterize a unit over a season. Having 20 is very small. Having 2,000 is very large. So something in the middle there. It also really depends on how confident you want to be. If you're comfortable with coarse estimates that have a bit of variation in them, smaller sample size is going to be fine for your purposes. If you've got a highly controversial topic and you need more precision and confidence, then you would want a larger sample. And it also depends on how many units or ways you're going to compare the data. For every comparison you're going to you need an adequately large sample within each of those units. So if you're going to compare across several locations, that increases the sample size needed quite considerably. So these are things just to think through, reason out, and make decisions based on professional judgment. Sometimes you might come down and say, I need a truly representative random sample. I only have resources to get a small one. Fine, that's what I'm going to do. Or I want to get more data across some different locations, and I'm going to be comfortable with a convenient sample. As a general rule, increasing your sample size improves your analytic power when sample sizes are small. So going from 20 to 50 gives you a lot more analytic power. Going from 50 to 100 gives you additional analytic power. Going from 500 to 1,000 gives you very little additional power. So there's very little value in having a lot more data after a certain overall sample size. All right, so let's turn now to data management and analysis, and a few things about this aspect of using surveys. Record keeping is really critical, and that includes some way of tracking non-response. If you don't know what your response rate is, you simply don't know how representative your data are. So for on-site surveys, that's tracking how many surveys are distributed and how many are returned. And reasons for refusal. A lot of times in recreation type of surveys, people don't want to do the survey not because they aren't interested, but they're running out of time, the kids are cranky, they want to get home to have dinner. And those are perfectly legitimate reasons. They're not they're not biased in the sense of being related to the topic of the study. So that is useful data to have as well. Data entry is a whole topic in and of itself, and there's a lot of guidance available for best practices. If you're using Survey123 or Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, something else, that takes care of the data entry piece on the back end, which is very nice. If you're using manual data entry, there's some things you need to think about in terms of setting up spreadsheets for being able to analyze them. Fortunately, there are a bunch of resources available, and this article that I have just screen captured here on the slide is an open access source, so we can make that available in our toolkit too. It's just a very accessible guide to how to organize data in spreadsheets and common mistakes people make and that you can avoid. Doing quality assurance and quality control throughout is important, making sure that things are getting filled out completely, making sure that there aren't erroneous data getting entered. And so all of these steps require time, they require planning, and sometimes that's easy to forget. We plan for collecting the data, and then we don't plan adequately on the back end for how are we going to manage and analyze the data. In terms of interpreting results, you've got all your data entered, you've got it cleaned up, you've done some initial analysis. It is important to remember that there's a very profound difference between statistical significance and practical significance. We often hear, well, what do I need to do to get statistically significant data? And that's not, that might not be the question that you want to ask. You may want to know, like, how can I get data that are actually of practical, or how will I know when the data tell me something that's of practical importance? So let me give a couple of examples. Let's say one of your indicators that you're measuring is related to conflict. I mentioned that earlier. And so we're looking at the percentage of people who reported that they had any conflict with visitors. If I have an enormous sample size, a rate of 5% of people saying that they experienced conflict might be statistically significant, because statistical significance is largely influenced by sample size. But is 5% practically important for you as a manager? Would you take action if you knew it was 5%? And that's not something the data can tell you. It's something that is a professional judgment. Let me give another example. Let's say we want to compare satisfaction rates between mountain bikers, equestrians, and hikers in terms of trail condition. And we ask this on a scale of -2 to +2, say, and we find out that mean level of satisfaction for one group is 1.5 on this 5-point scale. For the other group, it's 1.8. And that upper end of the scale is 2. And it's very possible that that difference would be statistically significant if I have large samples of both groups. A question you might ask yourself as a manager is, wow, both of these groups score really high, near the 2 on the endpoint, and they're very satisfied. So is the difference between the groups important? I would argue no. On the other hand, if you had one group that scored like -1.5 and one group that scored +1.5, that's probably something that you want to take a look at. So again, understanding, like, yes, statistical significance plays a role, but it doesn't tell you whether something is important enough to warrant management attention. If you are using convenience samples, which is often the case, I mean, all of these web surveys for all these planning efforts, that's what they're using, and it is useful information. It's important to bear in mind how many surveys you got from what kinds of demographic groups. If you're going to profile, say, what different activity groups feel, if you've only got 3 paragliders in your sample, I'd probably not report that. But if you have a lot of some other activity group who appear to be from a wide range of visitors, that might be more useful. Think about how the surveys have been distributed across characteristics of interest. I mean, how the responses are distributed. If you can get that information for convenience sample on site, like, how did I represent the different locations within the park well? Did I represent different modalities of access well, or something missing? You can still use what you've got, but you can also be straightforward about what might be a gap in your data. And again, collecting any of that other information that can help you gauge the representativeness. A final thought is for tracking trends over time, which is important in the VUM framework. If you are using surveys for VUM monitoring, the data need to be comparable. You've got to be able to know that a difference from time 1 to time 2 to time 3 is a real difference and not an artifact of some different kind of sampling or different kind of wording. And question wording can really change the nature of results. So being really clear that you're going to be, doing the same kind of thing over time, and just being aware if there are differences in characteristics of the sample. So it's just some last tips, and this kind of reiterates things I've said already, but think about how you're going to use the data. Think hard about this in advance so that you are using all the data that you've got and that you got it in a way that is usable. At the same time, especially for on-site surveys, I guess this is really for on-site surveys, the major cost is in the effort. It's getting somebody out on site, the time they spend contacting folks. So if there are things that can help you in the long run, you might be asking certain questions for visitor use management in this framework, but there may be other things that are useful. And this is the approach we used at Big Basin. We had a number of items that were directly related to the VUM framework that we were piloting, but we also had some questions about the Reimagining Big Basin principles and about facilities that can feed into the facilities master planning effort. Most of our time was getting out there, collecting the data, very little additional effort required for reporting those out. Training and documentation is really important, being consistent in how you approach visitors. If you do have random sampling approaches, laying those out, decision rules about what to do if you miss a sample date, and so on. We're going to be talking a little bit about the National Visitor Use Monitoring Framework in our webinar next week, but I just want to point out that they use a visitor survey here in this effort, and their field guide, this field guide's 128 pages long. I mean, it's a very complicated approach. Your protocols won't be that long, but typically they are several pages of written documentation, super important to hand off to the person down the road who's going to try to figure out what you did and replicate it in the future. And it helps make sure that your data are really high quality. And as I said, the consistency matters, coming back to the National Survey of Hunting, Fishing, and Wildlife Recreation. They have this statement in there. They made major changes to the questions and methodologies so they can't compare the data. So this is one of our few really, really good long-term data sets, and yet now we can't compare the data that we have now to the data that we had before, which I'm sure they had good reasons for, but it's unfortunate. Okay, so just to recap, understand how survey data can be used. Really important role in the VUM framework. Many experiential conditions are really best assessed through surveys. Proxy measures like observing, counting people really don't tell you about the kind of experience people are having. So surveys are really important for that. There are places where surveys maybe are less appropriate, or the kind of data that you might be getting shouldn't be used for certain kinds of purposes, like tracking trends over time based on some kind of openly available web survey. Select the approach that best suits your needs. Really do understand how the data are going to be used and then which method best suits your needs. And understand all of them have limitations. And so just understand what those are and be transparent about them. Design your effort carefully. Think about sampling, random sampling, convenient sampling, sample size. Folks like our team are always available to talk to folks. We have a lot of experience doing that, doing this kind of work, and really can help people think through like what is going to be adequate for your needs. And if you want to see an example of that, our reports for Big Basin lay out the overall approach that we took for integrating visitor use surveys in with our other monitoring efforts this summer to generate data and how that panned out. And then finally, attending to documentation and training to ensure that consistency and high quality data. All right, that's all that I have on surveys, and we have about 15 minutes left for questions and discussion. Before we switch to that, I do want to point out that we have a workshop on Monday next week. We're going to be talking about gathering attendance data and different ways that you can do that, some of the considerations and challenges in gathering attendance data. We have been fortunate to talk to a number of folks in different parks in California and have some California relevant examples that we're going to integrate into that discussion. And then on the 14th, we'll do a quick overview of the overall toolkit, which includes the recorded sessions from all 3 of these webinars, as well as some fact sheets, protocols that we have been developing and used in some of our previous work for a range of things. We have not monitored all types of conditions at Big Basin, but we have a number of protocols for things like monitoring social trails and monitoring impacts to backcountry campsites and things like that. That would be part of our overall toolkit. All right, with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and Madeline, you can stop the recording.